Good evening. Tonight I want to go over in the Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris discussion in Vancouver, the first discussion. I wanted to go over Sam's response to Jordan's introduction toward the beginning, and the majority of this video will be covering the minutes around the 7 to 10 minute mark in that video. If you care to go and look, and I do have links in the discussion area, in the box below in the video page. And I just wanted to kind of reiterate what Jordan is talking about, because he's driving home the point of what is driving Sam, which in a sense is part of what's driving the whole set of discussions, because I think Sam arranged for these discussions to be done. And so I'm going to go over a little bit of a couple quotes that Jordan said, and then give you Sam's response and then my thoughts on that. So Jordan says, the first thing is I think that what partly is driving you, if this is accurate, is that you want to ground a structure of ethics in something solid. And there's two things you want to avoid, two catastrophes, let's say. One is the catastrophe that you identified with religious fundamentalism, and the other is the catastrophe that is associated with moral relativism. Is that reasonable? And Sam answers, yeah, that's good. So we have that basis there. Jordan goes on to say how he talks about similar things a little bit different. He's happy that they agree so much. And Jordan says here that his terminology, so the terminology is slightly different, but I think, and this is Jordan to Sam, I think we're working on the same axis. So that's the first thing. And then in order to do that, it seems to me, and that's your first priority, and then maybe your second priority is something like you see undue suffering in the world, plenty of it, and you would think that things would be better if that wasn't the case. And that this morality, whatever it's going to be, that grounding thing, I added that. Jordan says, whatever it's going to be is at least going to ground itself in part on the presupposition that the less undue suffering in the world, the better. Is that also reasonable? And this is where we're getting to here, because Sam answers, yeah, and I would just add to that. So this is Sam now, back to Jordan. I would just add to that the positive side of the continuum as well. So, and I think he says, as you know, the word I use for this is well-being. And Jordan says, yeah. And Sam says, and I know from having, and he pauses and says, I don't think we spoke about this on my podcast, but from having seen you in other interviews, I think you think that phrase doesn't capture everything one could reasonably want, but I think that it does. It's an elastic suitcase term for a reason, and it's actually, and he says, and he pauses and he says, in reading your book, I realize there is a point of contact here, because you use being as though, with a capital B, being, as though it were imbued with significant gravitas. And so for me, and I agree with you that it's an appropriate use of being. And for me, well-being is simply just the positive side of being. If you know there's the negative side, the suffering, we want to mitigate. But I think however good consciousness can be in this universe, that well-being for me subsumes all of those possibilities. And so, let's see. I am going to reread a part of that real quick, because I didn't quite capture it the way I wanted to. I think I was holding this strange, because I want to make sure I try to explain it. I can't say it quite like Sam does, but I'm trying to express the content of what he said. I think you think that phrase, the well-being phrase, does not capture everything one could reasonably want, but I think that it does. It's an elastic suitcase term for a reason. And it's actually, and then he says, in reading your book, I realize there's a point of contact here because you use the word being, capital B, being, as though it were imbued with significant gravitas. And so for me, and I would agree with you that it's an appropriate use of being. And for me, well-being is simply just the positive side of being. You know, there's the negative side, the suffering we want to mitigate. But I think however good consciousness can be in this universe, that well-being for me subsumes all of those possibilities. So I think that captured it a little bit better. Fascinating stuff, because everyone's still kind of in agreement here. We're going to try to avoid, and I would agree with this, that the problem of moral relativism, and avoid religious, dogmatism, religious fundamentalism, and that sort of thing. And then the being and well-being. And here's what's interesting is I think that no one could argue. It's a little bit tricky. And this is what I'm going to try to get a grasp on or a pulse on here, because it's really not easy, but it sounds like it feels like it should be easy, and it feels like it's hard to argue with. And there's times where when you feel like something's a little bit off but you can't quite pin it, this is what I'm trying to figure out. And it's not that I'm overly doubting him. I'm just thinking it's not making the case he's kind of quite thinking that it does. And I think that might be what Jordan has kind of cued in on there as well a little bit, because Sam already expressed that Jordan had some reservations. And when he says that Jordan doesn't think that the term well-being captures everything one could reasonably want, I don't know that that's a fair representation of how I would put it anyway, in terms of, because it doesn't really make sense to put it like that. I wonder if that's been communicated that way, if maybe what was meant by Jordan is that, are you thinking what that, you think it sounds like that's meaning? Let's see, how can I put that in a different way? It's as if we think of the most of everything one could reasonably want, that sounds good. It sounds kind of almost like a fairy tale land. I mean, we all have things we want, and we know this world does not accommodate us to every, whim and fancy that we, desire, of course, and obviously. But I just find that it's an interesting topic to bring up at a time like this, as a possible form of an option to help ground ethics or morality, because that is the recurring theme. And especially if the interest in part is to avoid moral relativism, and that's been admitted at the forefront as something, as even like words like catastrophe are associated with that, and rightly so. So if we're just talking about ultimate worlds, ultimate ways of being, and say like you picture going on a vacation somewhere and life is going to be really nice. I mean, that you can almost picture everything you would reasonably want on a vacation like that. It's almost like I feel something like that might be being applied to life a little bit, and I can't figure out what that's supposed to do there. It's kind of like inserting something. It sounds good on its face, and I can't quite figure out what the point of that is. If it's if it's a measuring rod of sorts, a point of measurement, like, or a baseline. So here's, and I think I've a little bit heard Sam talk about this before, but I need to brush up on all of this and really learn what his argument actually is, because it's hard to ascertain through talks like this, at least at this point. If, say, you have that as a baseline, well-being, everything around the line of well-being is good, everything that gets away from it is worse. I feel like I've even heard him say something along those lines before, that it's to him a very straightforward, simple thought, and it does seem like that on its face. The part that becomes difficult is how that answers the greater need and question in play. That anchoring of grounding of ethics and morals. Because guess what you have there? All you need to find is two people on the planet that have completely opposing views. This is just a problem I see with it initially. And you've already got two possibly diametrically opposed views on what is well-being. For instance, let's look back at Auschwitz, which is brought up in this debate, or the Gulag Archipelago. You ask the people that were victims in those things what well-being is, and you ask the perpetrators what well-being is, guess what you're stuck with? You've got some serious, dogmatic, intense beliefs playing out there on the side of the people of the perpetrators there. And you've got what they think is well-being, and opposite, you've got the problem of relativism playing out, moral relativism, the fallout of it. What you have is actually the opposite of the goal. And at risk, and this is me putting my foot out there, talk about feeling free to discuss these ideas. That's what I want to do too. What Brett warned about in the beginning of these discussions was very good, to give people a place to really sit and talk about these things with the freedom to do so. That's kind of what I'm trying to do too. And I really appreciate the opportunity of being able to do this. So part of the problem, because I think the goals are excellent, and thus far I'm agreeing, I'm starting just to try to relay to you so that you can think through with me, because you might be a fan of Sam's, you might be as a fan of Jordan's, you might be a deeply religious person, you might be a part of a cult for all I know. I don't know. But regardless, these topics actually potentially really include and involve all of us. So it's worth all of us to think about these things, to give it some serious thought. The problem with talking about elevating well-being as a means of grounding, as of right now, I have not seen put forth yet a way to get out of that, the relativism woods, so to speak. Like we're stuck in the dark woods of relativism, so to speak. Potentially, like, it literally would take almost no time at all to see that play out. So what sometimes people would need. So say in the past we've got some bad ideas, but they thought they were good ideas, and they thought they had a moral backing to do the ideas. Say they did, and then they know that there's going to be pushback, because sometimes deep down you know something isn't quite right, and you're going to need something else to get your ideas pushed through. There's so many options of what human beings, what we will do at that point in time, and a lot of times it includes we can play games with ourselves. So you want, if someone's honestly discussing these things, you want to help point out, and that made it sound like I'm accusing them of this at this point. I'm not. What I'm saying is I'm justifying, as if I needed to. I'm kind of giving a defense of why it might look like I'm picking a little bit, but I feel like these guys would welcome it, because they are welcoming it of each other. And I'm not sure sometimes that Jordan really did nail down all the points that he could. Again, not going after Jordan either there, but these are just some points that I've seen. And it could be that I'm not recalling exactly Jordan addressing these same exact issues, only later on. And if that's the case, we'll just get to that when we get to that. So I find it interesting talking about well-being. I totally agree with that. The fact that it's an elastic suitcase term for a reason. That's interesting. That's really interesting to me. I'd love to know more what he means by that. That's Sam, I mean. But he's on the positive side of a continuum. But to me, it's kind of like akin to saying, I love to go to happy places and enjoy myself when there's sunshine and a cool breeze. And I love to have something nice and cool to drink. It's kind of like stating the obvious, at risk of sounding like, again, like I'm picking on this. I'm just genuinely struggling to see how it's much different, like or to elevate something, because what I described would be definitely a state of well-being. And it also, what about all the other things in the meantime, like that are going on in our lives? There's a lot of sickness. We've got cancers and diseases and different things going on. So it's just a matter of like, how do these things all play out, and how does this address grounding a moral ethic? This is kind of what I'm trying to do, or trying to get a feel for a bit more. The undue suffering in the world, again, I guess, and that's what Sam was saying, was the negative side. So we can go the full pendulum swing there. Undue suffering, bad. Ultimate well-being is ultimate good. And I think it's in essence, it starts to feel, because of what I know comes later, at risk of doing a spoiler here, I just want to say, if really what this is another way of asserting that I think these people are doing bad things, and I'm going to call these things bad, and here's why. Here's my view on these things as bad, then that's bad. And that's the new moral ethic is going to say, this is bad, or we can do away with this because it's bad. Isn't that just another way of saying you disagree with somebody? And that's where all the other details matter. I've talked about in my other videos where he's running as if a lot of conclusions and debates have been concluded, but I've not seen that myself. But there's a platform set up here in which it's as if all of those things have been concluded, and they haven't been at all. Often they're like, there's a lot of straw men involved, a lot of tactics and fallacies in play. And when that's the case, you can know that the people doing that tend to not always be in ownership of the best of the views, and that they would have to draw upon using tactics or fallacies, which is the point of pointing those out. It's not to pick on somebody. It's kind of like picking on the view for the person's own good. And I think that's what Sam thinks he often does with people's views. So if it's legitimate, maybe, but let's say it even was all legitimate. Let's say everything was on its face good as it appears. I guess I'd like to understand, and this is what we'll be looking for, right? As I go through these videos, breaking them apart like this, the goal will be to pinpoint how what is being said here, avoiding undue suffering, promoting well-being with people, how that equates to helping to establish a moral ethic in a way that's genuinely grounded, which is what is needed in order to avoid what they talk about here very soon, to avoid Auschwitz, to avoid a gulag, and similar types of things. What is needed is not something, I can't see that connection. I can't even stretch my mind right now, and that could just be a failing on my part. I can't begin to see how these things that are offered up would equate to being an ethic, instead of what turns out to be opinions, assertions, a take on a thing, and ultimately moral relativism. So moving on, I want to make sure I didn't miss anything else. So in Jordan's defense, I think Jordan is saying that this does not encapsulate everything. I think that Sam thinks it might, is what I was kind of trying to say earlier. Maybe it might be a better way of saying that. It's not that it doesn't capture. It's not, what it does is it's not capturing it because it's not what's needing to be captured. If someone were just, again, saying, let's talk about what a heaven on earth would be like, kind of thing, that would be an ultimate well-being kind of thing. As far as it as an idea goes, I don't think it's the first time it's been brought up. An ultimate wonderful state, ultimate well-being for humanity, and he uses the term horrible a bunch of horribleness, something later on. I wonder, what is he referring to there? Because a lot of the horrible things that happen in our world are just people making really bad choices. And also just things that happen, like the disease and the death. These are things that are out of the scope of the conversation, but that do weigh in when it comes to people experiencing well-being. So that's part of the dilemma. I think that might be all I want to say for this video, and I could have gone past this point, but I don't know that it's necessary, and it might be a good place to stop. Make sure one more thing here. We want to mitigate the suffering. Some of mitigating suffering has to do with encouraging people to stop their bad behavior. Don't we already have that in society? Don't we already have a lot of doctors and researchers trying to mitigate physical suffering? And however good consciousness can be in this universe, that sounds great. The ultimate consciousness, good, however good our consciousness can be in this universe, well-being subsumes that for all of those possibilities for Sam. This is interesting. I mean, again, this is not a novel thought. It's novel in the sense, it might be novel in the sense that it's the first time I'm seeing that it could be what's spoken of, along with avoiding undue suffering, as a possible base for morality. And I need to say this too. It's very possible I'm having the disconnect here, that I'm not seeing this for what it is. It just looks like that's how they've presented it. And as you can tell, if you're following any of these videos, I'm really breaking these down in really rather small pieces in order to digest them and be real careful with them. That's part of the goal. Jordan will go on to explain why he focused on the suffering side of it more. And that will get into more, into what I think they're trying to say. I want to make sure there's nothing else I wanted to say here. 1 second. So, I think I've touched on why Sam thought maybe Jordan has expressed that these views don't capture everything one could reasonably want. I don't think anyone would argue that talking about well-being in the way that Sam has would capture, as an idea, the idea that it could include everything someone would reasonably want. So something seems a little bit off there. So we'll explore it more as we move forward. That's part of the goal here. I really appreciate you listening to this. If you're still hanging in there listening, and I really appreciate that, because I think these are ideas with extreme things that will play out in our lives. I think that what these ideas do is get us to dance around the truth. Even if we don't ever really fully apprehend it, I think we get much closer to what actually is. And I think that should continually be our focus in this world, is to discover the source of the effects that we see playing out, like the morality that we see, that we're trying to make sense of and find some grounding for. Each person has a lot of similar moralities, senses of it within them. We tend to all balk at certain things. Like, even if you disagree with that statement, it would play out soon enough in life. We could probably point out in cultures around the world instances where we really aren't all that different in a lot of ways, even though we are in a lot of other ways. So we'll get into more all of that later. Again, thank you. Have a great evening. Bye-bye.